Watch it, she snapped, voice like cracking ice. That's how it started. One spilled drop of wine, and a woman who thought she owned the world. But Ara knew better. She knew the glint of that sapphire ring, the star of Serafina. It wasn't just some bauble, it was hers. Stolen, really. You see, her family built empires until Julian Thorne's father tore them down. Now Thorne thinks he can silence her with a glare, buy her off with a threat. He sees a waitress. He doesn't see the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength she inherited. He doesn't know she's about to ignite a scandal that will burn his carefully constructed life to ashes. Oh, they have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Watch it, she snapped, voice like cracking ice. That's how it started. One spilled drop of wine and a woman who thought she owned the world. But Ara knew better. She knew the glint of that sapphire ring, the star of Serafina. It wasn't just some bauble, it was hers. Stolen, really. You see, her family built empires until Julian Thorne's father tore them down. Now Thorne thinks he can silence her with a glare, buy her off with a threat. He sees a waitress. He doesn't see the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength she inherited. He doesn't know she's about to ignite a scandal that will burn his carefully constructed life to ashes. Oh, they have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The clatter of silver against bone china played a familiar melody in Ara's ears, the soundtrack to her servitude. At Aurelia, the city's elite came to preen, posture, and consume, oblivious to the army of invisible staff that kept their gilded cage running. Ara moved through the room like a ghost, refilling champagne flutes, delivering overpriced appetizers, a silent observer in a theater of excess. It hadn't always been this way. Once she'd belonged on the other side of the velvet rope. Caldwell was a name synonymous with old money, old values. Her father, Robert, a man of unwavering integrity, believed his word was his bond. Her mother, Serafina, possessed a quiet grace. Her most treasured possession, a sapphire ring of impossible beauty, the star of Serafina. It was more than a jewel. It was a symbol of their family's legacy, a constant reminder of their love and prosperity. Then came the storm, a hostile takeover engineered by sharks in tailored suits. Her father's principles were no match for their ruthlessness. The Caldwell empire crumbled, leaving them with nothing but shattered dreams and a mountain of debt. Robert Caldwell, broken by the betrayal, suffered a stroke that stole his voice and his mobility. Serafina, her spirit crushed, faded away 2 years later, the smell of her neighbor's cooking clinging to the air of their cramped apartment. The star of Serafina, their last vestige of dignity, was sold to cover medical bills, the memory of her mother's trembling hands forever etched in Ara's mind. Now, 10 years later, Ara was an art history student by day, a waitress by night, navigating a world she once inhabited. The irony wasn't lost on her. She studied Renaissance masterpieces while serving beluga caviar to the people who owned them. Her past was a forbidden chapter, buried deep beneath layers of resentment and grief. Tonight, Julian Thorne occupied table 7. A titan of tech and finance, he possessed a reputation as ruthless as he was handsome. His company, Omnicorp, controlled everything from satellites to pharmaceuticals. Beside him sat Beatrice Vanderbilt, a vision of wasp perfection, her pedigree as impeccable as her designer gown. Mr. Dubois, Aurelia's perpetually panicked manager, had drilled the instructions into Ara's head. Table 7 is sacred. Efficiency and invisibility, Caldwell. Got it? She approached the table, a bottle of Chateau Margaux in hand, her movements precise and practiced. Mr. Thorne, Miss Vanderbilt, she murmured, her voice a polite hum. Thorne didn't bother to acknowledge her, his eyes glued to his phone. Beatrice extended her hand for her wine, and as the chandelier's light danced on her fingers, Ara froze. The ring. It wasn't a coincidence, a similar design. It was the ring. The star-shaped halo of diamonds surrounding the cornflower blue sapphire was unmistakable. The delicate platinum filigree, crafted into interwoven vines, was exactly as she remembered. A wave of nausea washed over her, the restaurant's ambiance fading into a distant hum. 16 again, she saw her mother's face crumple as the ring was placed into its velvet coffin. Her hand trembled. A single drop of crimson wine stained the pristine white tablecloth. "Watch it," she snapped, voice like cracking ice. Julian Thorne finally looked up, his gray eyes, cold and sharp, fixed on Aura. Not angry, not yet. Just the detached annoyance one might feel towards a bothersome insect. "Is there a problem?" His voice, low and dangerous, sent a shiver down her spine. Mr. Dubois' warning echoed in her head. "Be invisible. Don't speak." Her job, her father's care, depended on her silence. But seeing that ring, worn with such casual indifference while her father languished in a sterile room, ignited a fire she thought long extinguished. The Caldwell pride, buried beneath years of hardship, surged to the surface. Swallowing hard, Aura focused on the ring. The blood pounded in her ears, but she found her voice, shaky yet clear, slicing through the hushed atmosphere. "I'm sorry," she began, lifting her gaze to meet Thorne's steely stare. "It's just that ring." She took a deep breath, crossing the point of no return. "My mother once owned that ring." The 9 words hung in the air, delicate and devastating. A beat of silence, then a bubble of shock spread from table 7, silencing the rest of the room. The diners at adjacent tables, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to steal glances. Beatrice Vanderbilt was the first to recover. She let out a short, incredulous laugh that was more of a scoff. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" She held up her hand, flaunting the sapphire. "This ring? You think your mother owned this ring?" Her eyes raked over Aura, lingering on her simple uniform. A silent, brutal dismissal. "Darling, this is a Thorne family heirloom. It's been in Julian's family for generations. I highly doubt it ever graced the hand of a waitress's mother." The word waitress dripped with venom, designed to shrink Aura, to shove her back into her invisible box. But Aura didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on Julian Thorne, who had yet to speak. His face was a mask of cold fury, a muscle twitching in his tight jaw. He wasn't looking at her with annoyance anymore. He was looking at her with an intensity that was far more terrifying. "It's called the Star of Seraphina," Aura said, her voice gaining strength. "The sapphire is from the Kashmir region, known for its velvety cornflower blue. The setting is early 20th century Parisian, custom-made, and on the inside of the band, there's a tiny, almost invisible inscription. It reads, Amor Fati, love of one's fate, her father's favorite philosophy, inscribed as a gift to her mother." Beatrice's perfectly sculpted smile faltered. She instinctively tried to look at the inside of the ring, but Julian's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with startling force. His grip wasn't gentle. "That's enough," he said, his voice a low growl, but his eyes were still locked on Aura, searching, probing, not for truth, but for leverage. "What is this? Some kind of shakedown? Did you research me? My fiancé? What do you want? Money?" The accusation was a blow. Tears pricked Aura's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I don't want anything," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage and hurt. I saw it. I couldn't not say something. That ring was my mother's whole world. It was the last piece of my family that was sold when we lost everything." The raw, unscripted pain in her voice was undeniable. It caused a ripple of discomfort at the nearby tables. People were openly staring. Mr. Dubois was gliding towards them, his face pale with panic. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thorne?" he whispered, his voice strained. Julian ignored him. He slowly released Beatrice's wrist and leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The predator was now entirely focused on his prey. "Your family," Julian said, his voice deceptively soft. "And what family would that be?" "The Caldwells," Aura replied, lifting her chin. "My father is Robert Caldwell." At the mention of that name, something flickered in Julian Thorne's eyes. It wasn't recognition, but something deeper, a shadow passing behind his cold facade. It was there for only a second, then gone. Beatrice, however, scoffed again. "Caldwell of Caldwell Shipping? I remember them. They went bankrupt years ago. A spectacular failure." She waved a dismissive hand. "So, you're a fallen princess. How tragic. It doesn't mean you can lay claim to my engagement ring. This story is pathetic." "Beatrice, be quiet," Julian commanded, his tone sharp enough to make her recoil. He hadn't taken his eyes off Ara. The air around the table thrummed with unspoken history and a looming confrontation. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. This was the moment, the reaction that would change everything. Ara expected him to call security. She expected him to have her thrown out, to mock her, to ruin her. He did none of those things. Julian Thorne slowly, deliberately, began to remove a black credit card, the infamous Centurion, made of anodized titanium, from his wallet. He placed it on the table. Then he looked at Aura, and his face was utterly devoid of emotion, a chilling, terrifying blankness. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. It was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the silent dining room with the force of a thunderclap. "You have 60 seconds, he began, his eyes boring into hers. "You will go to your manager. You will tell him you quit. You will collect your things and you will walk out of that door. If you are still in this building in 61 seconds, I will not only ensure you never work in this city again, I will personally call my legal team and launch a lawsuit against you for harassment and attempted fraud. So monumental you will be burying your family in debt, not paying for their care." He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. He just delivered the sentence with the detached precision of a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't an angry outburst. It was a cold, systematic annihilation of her life. Mr. Dubois looked like he was about to faint. Beatrice smirked, a look of triumphant vindication on her face. The other patrons stared, mouths agape, speechless. He had left everyone speechless. Era felt the floor drop out from under her. The air was stolen from her lungs. This was a power she couldn't comprehend, the power to erase someone with a few whispered words. The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. She gave a single, jerky nod, turned on her heel and walked away from the table, her legs unsteady beneath her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Behind her, she could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but most of all, she could feel the chilling, victorious gaze of Julian Thorne. She had told him the truth, a truth etched into her soul, and his reaction was not to question it, but to extinguish it. As she pushed through the kitchen doors, the sound of her own heartbreaking was louder than the silence she left behind. The walk to the employee locker room was a blur of shame and disbelief. The cacophony of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, the shouts of the chefs, felt a world away from the frozen silence of the dining room. Ara's hands shook so violently she could barely unbutton her uniform. She stripped it off, throwing it into the bottom of her locker as if it were contaminated. Mr. Dubois found her there, leaning against the cold metal, her street clothes feeling foreign on her skin. He looked pained, his usual bluster gone. "Ara, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "You know I had no choice. He's one of our most important patrons. The owner would have my head." "I know, Mr. Dubois," she whispered, her voice flat. "It's not your fault." "What were you thinking?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. To say that to him. "I was thinking about my mother," she said, pulling on her worn coat. "That's all." She walked out of Aurelia's back alley entrance, the stench of garbage and gourmet food scraps filling the humid night air. The life she had painstakingly pieced together, the job that paid for her father's care, the semblance of stability, had been demolished in less than a minute. Julian Thorne hadn't just fired her, he had salted the earth where her life once stood. The weight of his threat pressed down on her, a promise of total ruin. Back in the gilded cage of the restaurant, the atmosphere at table 7 was glacial. Beatrice, flushed with victory, took a triumphant sip of her wine. "Well, that's dealt with," she said. "The nerve of that girl, a Caldwell. Honestly, it's just sad. She probably saw the ring in a magazine once and concocted that whole sob story." Julian didn't respond. He stared at the single drop of red wine on the tablecloth, a tiny mar on the perfect white canvas. He should have felt vindicated. He had squashed a nuisance, protected his family's name, and put a delusional nobody in her place. That was how his world worked. Power was a tool, and he used it with precision. So why did he feel a sliver of ice in his gut? Amor Fati. He had never looked for an inscription. Why would he? His father, Alistair Thorne, had given him the ring, telling him it had belonged to Julian's grandmother, a Thorne heirloom. It was a story as solid and unquestionable as their family fortune. He had never had a reason to doubt it until now. The girl, Ara Caldwell. Her eyes, there was no cunning in them, no hint of a calculated scam. There was just pain, a deep, abyssal grief that he recognized because he had seen a version of it in his own mirror after his mother passed away. Liars were greedy, grieving daughters were haunted, and she had looked haunted. "Julian, did you hear me?" Beatrice's voice cut through his thoughts. "I was saying we should order the truffle risotto." "I've lost my appetite," he said curtly, pushing his chair back. He stood up, towering over the table. "I'm leaving." "Leaving? But we haven't even had our entree," Beatrice protested, her face a mask of confusion and frustration. "You stay. Enjoy your meal," he commanded, tossing his black card onto the table. "Get a car home." He walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance, leaving his fiancée sitting alone amidst the wreckage of their perfect evening. The drive back to his sterile, glass-walled penthouse overlooking Central Park was on autopilot. His mind was a maelstrom. The Caldwells. Robert Caldwell. The name was familiar, but not in a social context. It was a business file, a ghost from his father's past. Alistair Thorne had built his empire on the ruins of others. He called it strategic acquisition. The world called it corporate raiding. Julian had learned the game at his father's knee, and he played it better than anyone. He'd never questioned the methods, only the results. He stormed into his penthouse and went straight to the liquor cabinet, pouring a generous measure of Macallan 25. He swirled the amber liquid, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy he had conquered, but he felt no triumph. He thought of the waitress, her defiant chin, the quiet dignity she clung to even as he was destroying her. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, he slipped the engagement ring from his pocket, where he'd put it after taking it from Beatrice's hand at the restaurant. Under the bright focused light of his desk lamp, he examined the inside of the band with a magnifying glass from his desk drawer. His blood ran cold. There, so small as to be almost invisible to the naked eye, were the two etched words. Two words that had no business being there. Two words that proved the waitress wasn't lying. Amor Fati. A wave of something dark and unsettling washed over him. The foundation of the story he'd been told his entire life had just cracked. This ring was not a Thorne heirloom. It had belonged to someone else. It had belonged to Serafina Caldwell. His father had lied to him. The lie wasn't the problem. Julian lived in a world of lies. They were the currency of power. The problem was why? Why this specific lie? Why pass off this particular ring with its secret history as a family treasure? He downed the scotch in one go, the burn in his throat doing nothing to quell the cold fire in his gut. His first instinct was to destroy the source of the problem. Ruin the girl so completely she would never be heard from again. Bury the truth. That was the Thorne way. But another unfamiliar instinct fought its way to the surface. A nagging, persistent curiosity, a sliver of doubt that had now widened into a chasm. He had built his empire on data, on facts, on knowing every variable. And right now, the biggest variable was a fired waitress named Ara Caldwell. He walked over to his laptop, his movements sharp and decisive. He didn't call his legal team to sue her. He called his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Mikhail. "Mikhail," he said, his voice low and intense, "I need you to find someone. Her name is Ara Caldwell. I want to know everything. Where she lives, where she goes to school, her family history, her financial situation, everything. And I want to know about her father, Robert Caldwell. Specifically, I want every detail you can find about the collapse of Caldwell Shipping a decade ago. I want to know who was involved. I want to know who picked the bones clean." He paused, staring out at the city that was supposed to be his. "And get me everything you can on a ring known as the Star of Serafina. I want its complete provenance. No stone unturned." He hung up the phone. He was no longer trying to bury the truth. He was going to excavate it, and he had a sinking feeling that whatever he was about to unearth was going to be far uglier than a simple lie. For 3 days, Ara existed in a fog of despair. The city that had once felt full of possibility now seemed like a concrete prison. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched, expecting a summons from Julian Thorne's lawyers. She spent her hours poring over job listings for waitressing gigs, knowing her name was likely already blacklisted. The money in her bank account dwindled, a ticking clock counting down to the moment she wouldn't be able to pay for her father's care facility. She visited him on the third day. The facility was clean but bleak, smelling of antiseptic and quiet resignation. Robert Caldwell sat in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at a small, manicured lawn. The stroke had stolen most of his ability to speak, leaving him trapped inside a body that had betrayed him. But his eyes were still sharp. They could still convey the love, the pride, and the profound sadness that defined his existence. Ara held his hand, its skin thin and papery, and told him about her classes, about a funny dog she saw in the park, about anything other than the truth. She didn't tell him she'd lost her job. She didn't tell him she had seen the ring. She couldn't bear to put that pain back into his eyes. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, kissing his forehead before she left. He squeezed her hand, a flicker of the powerful man he once was, and the gesture both warmed and broke her heart. Meanwhile, Julian Thorne was descending into a rabbit hole of his own family's making. Mikhail was ruthlessly efficient. The first report landed on his desk within 24 hours. It was a dossier on Ara Caldwell, her stellar academic record at Columbia University, her mother's death certificate, the crushing list of debts, and the address of the care facility for Robert Caldwell. Every detail painted a portrait of a young woman fighting an impossible battle with quiet, desperate tenacity. There was no hint of a scam artist. The second report arrived a day later. It was the provenance of the ring. It had been commissioned in 1925 by the Dubois family in Paris, passed through several hands, and was finally purchased by Robert Caldwell in the late 1990s as a wedding anniversary gift for his wife, Serafina. It was officially, publicly, a Caldwell piece. The trail went cold 10 years ago. Mikhail's report stated it was sold in a private, unrecorded sale. There was no mention of the Thorne family, not until it appeared on Beatrice Vanderbilt's finger. The final report was the one Julian dreaded most. It was a deep dive into the collapse of Caldwell Shipping, and the name at the center of it, the architect of the entire hostile takeover, the predator who had dismantled a century-old company for parts, was a name Julian knew better than his own. Alistair Thorne, his father. The documents laid it all out in cold, hard print. Alistair, through a series of shell corporations and back-channel dealings, had initiated the attack. He'd manipulated stock prices, bribed a key board member, and exploited a temporary vulnerability in the company's finances. It wasn't just business, it was a massacre. Robert Caldwell's handshake mentality had made him an easy target for a man who saw honor as a weakness to be exploited. The final damning piece of information was a copy of a private sales agreement unearthed from a retired art dealer's records, dated 2 weeks after the Caldwell bankruptcy was finalized. It was for the sale of one item, the Star of Serafina. The buyer was a shell corporation. The price was a pittance, a fraction of its market value. The kind of price a desperate man trying to pay for his family's survival would accept. That shell corporation was owned by another shell corporation, which was, at the very end of the chain, owned by Thorne Industries. Julian felt a profound, sickening lurch in his stomach. The ring wasn't just a lie, it was a trophy, a spoil of war. His father hadn't just defeated Robert Caldwell, he had taken the most precious symbol of his family, and then, years later, had the audacity to pass it off to his own son as a symbol of their family's legacy. It was a gesture of supreme, monstrous arrogance. That evening, Julian drove to his father's sprawling estate in Westchester, the reports burning a hole in his briefcase. Alistair Thorne was in his study, a cavernous room of dark wood and leather, a portrait of himself hanging over the marble fireplace. He was a man who radiated power, even in his old age, his eyes still holding the predatory gleam that had made him a legend. "Julian," Alistair said, a pleased smile on his face, "an unexpected visit. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked to the mahogany desk and dropped the folder on it. The sound echoed in the silent room. The Caldwell ring, Julian said in his briefcase. A Leicester thorn was in his study, a cavernous room of dark wood and leather, a portrait of himself hanging over the marble fireplace. He was a man who radiated power even in his old age, his eyes still holding the predatory gleam that had made him a legend. "Julian," a Leicester said, a pleased smile on his face. "An unexpected visit to what do I owe the pleasure?" Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked to the mahogany desk and dropped the folder on it. The sound echoed in the silent room. The Caldwell ring. Julian said, his voice flat and cold. "I want you to tell me about it." A Leicester's smile didn't falter, but a shudder came down over his eyes. "The family heirloom. What about it? Did Beatrice not like it? We can find another." "Stop lying." Julian snapped, the words erupting from him with a force that surprised them both. "I know where it came from. I know you bought it off Robert Caldwell after you destroyed him. I know it's not a Thorn heirloom. I want to know why. Why would you give it to me and tell me it was Grandma's?" Alistair leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm. He steepled his fingers. "It was a lesson, Julian, a story. All heirlooms begin somewhere. We are the start of a new dynasty, one more powerful than the Caldwells ever were. I took their symbol and made it ours. It's a symbol of your birthright. It represents the victory of our way of doing things over their antiquated, sentimental nonsense." Julian stared at his father, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a man who reveled in the humiliation of his rivals, a man who saw cruelty as a virtue. "You destroyed a man's life," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. "You took his legacy, his company, his wife's ring, and you call it a lesson." "I call it winning," Alistair retorted, his voice hardening. "A lesson you seem to have forgotten. I heard about the incident at Aurelia. The waitress, you should have crushed her. You should have sued her into oblivion the moment she opened her mouth. Instead, you're here questioning me, looking like a sentimental fool yourself." "She told the truth," Julian roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "She wasn't lying. Truth." Alistair laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Truth is a luxury for people who can't afford lawyers. We make our own truth, Julian. I gave you that ring as a reminder of who you are, a thorn, the son of a winner. Now I suggest you go back to your fiancée, forget all this nonsense and start acting like it." Julian felt a chasm open between him and his father. He had spent his life aspiring to be this man, to earn his approval, to be even more ruthless, more successful. Now looking at him, all he felt was a profound sense of disgust and shame. The entire foundation of his identity, the legacy he was meant to carry, was built on a bed of lies and cruelty. He picked up the folder, his hands steady now. The rage had cooled into a hard, clear resolve. "No," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I think for the first time I'm going to act like a man, not just a thorn." He turned and walked out of the study, leaving Alistair sitting in the dark, the portrait of his own mug face, mocking him from above the fireplace. Julian didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't live with the truth buried, and the only person who deserved to hear it was the one person whose life he had threatened to annihilately destroy. He had to find Caldwell. Finding Ara's apartment was easy for a man with Julian's resources. Getting out of his chauffeured Maybach in her rundown Queens neighborhood was another matter. The building was a pre-war walk-up with crumbling facade and a faint smell of boiled cabbage in the hallway. It was a universe away from his glass tower in Manhattan. For the first time, Julian felt like an intruder, an alien species stepping into a world he had only ever viewed from a great and comfortable height. He found her door number 4B and hesitated. What was he going to say? "Sorry, my father destroyed your family and I threatened to finish the job." He carried a small, heavy velvet box in his coat pocket. It felt like a lead weight on his conscience. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened a crack held by a brass security chain. One of Ara's brown eyes, wide and fearful, peered out at him. The instant she recognized him, the fear was replaced by a flash of anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low and tense. Have your lawyers come to serve the papers personally? No, Julian said quickly. No lawyers. I please talk to you for a moment? It's important. She stared at him for a long moment, suspicion etched on her face. Why should I talk to you? Because I was wrong, he said the words, feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. And because you were right. His admission seemed to stun her more than his threats had. After a tense silence, she slid the chain off and opened the door, stepping back to let him in, but not welcoming him. Her apartment was tiny but clean. Books were stacked on every available surface, art history texts next to worn paperbacks. A small desk was cluttered with notes for her studies. On a small end table was a single-frame photograph of a beautiful smiling woman wearing the star of Serafina Caldwell. The reality of his family's actions hit him with renewed force. You have 5 minutes, Alara said, crossing her arms. She stood by the window, putting as much distance between them as the small room would allow. Julian didn't know where to begin, so he started with the truth. I investigated your claim, he said, his voice formal. I looked into the ring's provenance, and I looked into the history of Caldwell shipping. He paused, meeting her weary gaze. You were telling the truth about everything. The inscription is there. The ring belonged to your mother, and my father, Alistair Thorne, was the man behind the hostile takeover that ruined your family. Era didn't look surprised. She just looked tired, a bitter sadness settling in her eyes. So you know, she said quietly. You know, and you came here. Why to gloat? To tell me you finished the job your father started? No, Julian said, taking a step closer. I came here to apologize. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. He didn't open it. He simply held it out to her. And to return this, it belongs to you. It always has. Era stared at the box in his outstretched hand, as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't move to take it. You think you can just show up here with that ring and apologize? She asked, her voice trembling with a decade of repressed grief and anger. You think that makes it right? Do you have any idea what my family went through? My father, he sits in a chair all day, unable to speak because of what your father did. My mother died of a broken heart in a place just like this. And you? You stood in that restaurant and threatened to take the last little bit I had left. An apology and a ring. Don't fix that. Every word was a deserved blow, and Julian took them without flinching. I know they don't, he said, his voice roar with a sincerity he rarely felt. Nothing can fix it, but it's a start. I didn't know, Alara. I swear to you, I didn't know the history. My father told me it was my grandmother's. I was arrogant and cruel, and I am more sorry than I can possibly say for what I did to you that night. He placed the box on the small coffee table between them. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I haven't earned it. I just want you to have what is rightfully yours. Era finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a billionaire titan. She saw a man grappling with a terrible truth. His usual mask of cold authority stripped away, revealing something more complex and pained underneath. The tension in the room was broken by the shrill ring of Julian's phone. He glanced at the caller ID. It was Beatrice. He ignored it. It rang again immediately. You should probably get that. Era said, her tone flat. Your fiancé must be worried. She's not my fiancé anymore, Julian stated simply. R's eyebrows shot up. What? I ended it this afternoon, he explained. When I confronted her with the truth about the ring, her only concern was how much it was worth and whether I would be buying her a bigger one to replace it, she said. She said she didn't want to be associated with your family's drama. He let out a humoral laugh. It turns out our entire relationship was as hollow as my father's story about the ring. That piece of information changed the dynamic in the room. He hadn't just come to apologize. He had started to dismantle the life built on that lie. He had stood up to his fiancée, and Asara now knew to his powerful father. It was a seismic shift. Ara slowly walked over to the coffee table and looked down at the velvet box. She didn't open it. What will your father do? She asked. I don't care, Julian said. This is bigger than him. It's bigger than Thorne Industries. This is about justice or something like it. He looked around her apartment at the books and the single photo of her mother. What happened to your family was wrong, and I want to help you make it right. Ara looked from the box to his face. The offer was terrifying and tantalizing. For 10 years, she had been powerless, a victim of forces far beyond her control. Now the son of her family's destroyer was standing in her living room offering her the one thing she had never dared to hope for a chance to fight back. She finally reached out and picked up the velvet box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The star of Serafina winked up at her, its blue depths seeming to hold all the sorrow and beauty of her past. She closed the box with a soft click. "Okay, Thorn," she said, her voice steady and clear, her eyes locking with his. "Let's talk about justice." The small apartment, once a symbol of Ara's reduced circumstances, became the unlikely headquarters for their alliance. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer a billionaire and a waitress. It was two people bound by a shared ugly history, seeking a truth that could either redeem them or destroy them both. Julian, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and leveraging billions, found himself deferring to Ara's knowledge of her family's history. She brought out old company ledgers, her father's diaries, and letters that painted a vivid picture of Caldwell Shipping before its fall. It was a company built on trust and a sense of family among its employees, a stark contrast to the cutthroat, impersonal machine of Omnipe. "My father's partner, a man named Marcus Blackwood, betrayed him," Eyre explained one evening, pointing to a name in one of the diaries. "My father trusted him like a brother. According to his journal, Marcus was the one who convinced him to take on a risky level of debt for a new fleet expansion right before a manufactured slump in the market. It left the company vulnerable. It was the opening your father needed. Julian took the information and fed it to Mickey's team. Within a day, they had a financial trace. Marcus Blackwood had received a multi-million-dollar payment from one of Alistair's shell corporations 2 months after the bankruptcy. He was now living a life of quiet luxury in the Cayman Islands. It was the smoking gun. Their collaboration was intense. They spent long hours together, fueled by coffee and a mutual burning need for resolution. Julian saw the brilliant analytical mind that had been hiding behind a waitress's apron. Eyre, in turn, began to see past the arrogant corporate raider to the man beneath, a man deeply wounded by his father's deception and desperate to carve out a moral identity of his own. A strange intimacy grew between them. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something forged in the crucible of their shared mission, a deep and abiding respect. He would watch her, lost in thought, her brow furrowed as she deciphered a line from her father's notes, and feel a sense of admiration he had never felt for the polished, superficial women in his own circle. She would listen as he ruthlessly dissected a financial document, his mind, a weapon of incredible precision, and see the potential for that weapon to be used for good. The ring, the star of Serafina, sat on the coffee table during their meetings, a silent witness. Eyre never wore it. She said it felt wrong, tainted by the journey it had taken. "It won't feel right on my finger," she told him, "until my father's name is cleared." The biggest challenge remained Alistair Thorn. As soon as Julian began digging deeper, his father fought back. Julian found his corporate accounts frozen, his access to certain company resources revoked. Alistair was sending a clear message: "Stop this or you will be cut off." One afternoon, Julian returned to his penthouse to find Alistair waiting for him, his face like a thundercloud. "This little quest of yours ends now," Alistair seethed. "You are jeopardizing a multi-billion-dollar enterprise for the sake of some sob story from a girl who should be serving you coffee. You are a thorn. Start acting like it." "I am," Julian replied calmly, loosening his tie. "I'm cleaning up a mess that a thorn made years ago. It's called taking responsibility. You should try it sometime." "Responsibility?" Alistair scoffed. "Let me tell you about responsibility. It's to your shareholders, to your legacy, to the family name, not to the ghosts of failures you walk over on your way to the top. I'm warning you, Julian. Drop this or I will disown you. You will lose everything. I've already lost the one thing I thought I had." Julian said, his voice quiet. "My respect for my father." The finality in his tone shook Alistair. He saw that his threats were useless. Julian was no longer the son who craved his approval. He was his own man. Enraged, Alistair left. But the war had just begun. The final piece of the puzzle was a man named Richard Sterling, the former chief financial officer of Caldwell Shipping, a man who had vanished after the collapse. Ilara remembered him as a kind, nervous man who was devoted to her father. After weeks of searching, Mikhail's team located him living under a different name in rural Vermont, working as a high school math teacher. Julian and Ara flew to Vermont themselves. They found Sterling in a modest clapboard house. He was older, grayer, and his eyes were filled with a decade of fear. At first he refused to speak, terrified of Alistair Thorne's reach. But then Ara spoke. She didn't talk about stocks or takeovers. She talked about the company picnics. She talked about how Sterling had taught her to play chess in her father's office. She talked about how her father, Robert Caldwell, had considered him family. Tears welled in the old man's eyes. The dam of his silence finally broke. He confessed everything. Alistair Thorne had not just bribed Marcus Blackwood. He had blackmailed Sterling using a personal indiscretion from his past to force him to cook the books, making the company's position look far worse than it was, and creating the panic that led to its collapse. Sterling had lived with the guilt ever since. He agreed to sign a sworn affidavit detailing Alistair's crimes. With Sterling's testimony and the financial evidence of the bribe to Blackwood, they had everything they needed. They had the undeniable truth. The question was what to do with it. A public lawsuit would be messy, a media circus that would devastate what was left of both their families. "There's only one way this ends," Julian said as they flew back to New York. "It's not in a courtroom, it's in the boardroom." He called a special emergency meeting of the Thorne Industries Board of Directors. It was an unprecedented move, a direct challenge to his father's authority as CEO and chairman. He was risking everything, his position, his inheritance, his entire future. He and walked into the towering Thorne Industries building together. The employees stared as Julian, the heir apparent, strode through the lobby with the former waitress at his side. They were not a couple. They were partners, soldiers marching into their final battle. The truth was their only weapon. The boardroom at Thorne Industries was on the 80th floor, a cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the city. It was Alistair Thorne's throne room, and he sat at the head of the long marble table, his face a mask of cold fury. The 10 board members, powerful men and women who owed their fortunes to Alistair, looked on with a mixture of confusion and trepidation. Julian stood at the opposite end of the table, with Ara seated calmly to his right. She wasn't dressed as a waitress or a student. She wore a simple, elegant gray dress, her posture erect, her gaze steady. She was no longer a victim. She was a Caldwell, reclaiming her family's honor. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Julian began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I have called this meeting because a matter of grave importance concerning the ethical foundation of this company has come to my attention. It concerns an acquisition made over a decade ago, the company formerly known as Caldwell Shipping." Alistair slammed his hand on the table. "This is a private family matter, Julian. It has no place here. This meeting is adjourned." "It ceased to be a family matter," Julian retorted, his voice cutting through his father's bluster, "when company funds were used to bribe, blackmail, and fraudulently dismantle a competitor. And it became a board matter when the CEO of this company began using his corporate power to obstruct an investigation into those crimes." He proceeded to lay out the entire story, his presentation as precise and devastating as a legal indictment. He presented the bank records proving the bribe to Marcus Blackwood. He read key passages from Richard Sterling's sworn affidavit detailing the blackmail. His narrative was cold, factual, and undeniable. He stripped away the myth of Alistair Thorne, the brilliant strategist, and revealed the truth: Alistair Thorne, the criminal. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were loyal to Alistair, but they were more loyal to the company's stock price and their own reputations. A public scandal of this magnitude would be catastrophic. Finally, Julian looked directly at his father. "The evidence is overwhelming. It is clear that Alistair Thorne acted illegally and unethically, exposing this company to immense legal and financial risk. Therefore, I am formally making a motion for his immediate removal as CEO and chairman of the board, effective immediately." A stunned silence fell over the room. Julian had not just challenged his father. He had declared war on him in front of his own court. Allister rose to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You ungrateful whelp," he spat at Julian. "You would throw away your own father, your own legacy for her." He gestured contemptuously at Aurora. Era met his gaze without flinching. "He isn't doing this for me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He's doing this for the name you tarnished. The name Thorne." That was the final blow. The board saw it. Then this wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. They could side with the corrupt, aging lion or with the young, principled leader who was trying to save the company from his father's sins. One by one they voted. It was almost unanimous. Allister Thorne was stripped of his titles and forced into retirement. His reign was over. Julian was voted in as the interim CEO. In the aftermath, Julian didn't seek to destroy his father further. The public story was that Allister was stepping down for health reasons. But in the circles where it mattered, the truth was known. The real justice was not in a prison sentence, but in the quiet, complete dismantling of his power and reputation. The most important part of the resolution happened privately. Julian, as head of Thor Industries, drew up a settlement. It wasn't charity, it was reparations. A significant sum was transferred to a trust for the Caldwell family, enough to ensure Robert Caldwell would receive the best care for the rest of his life and to restore a measure of the wealth that had been stolen. Furthermore, Julian established a charitable foundation in Serafina Caldwell's name dedicated to promoting ethical business practices. A week later, Julian found Dara at her father's care facility. She was sitting with him by the window, and for the first time in years, she saw a genuine, peaceful smile on her father's face. Julian waited until she came out. "How is he?" "He's better," Ara said, a real smile, gracing her own lips. "The new facility is wonderful. He seems at peace. He knows. I think somehow he knows we won." They walked through the facility's garden, the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows. "I have something for you," Julian said. He handed her a simple envelope. Inside was a job offer, not for a waitress, but for a position as the head curator of the new Thorne Industries art collection, with a special fund to acquire pieces from struggling young artists. It was a perfect blend of her passion and her past. "Julian, I don't know what to say," she stammered, overwhelmed. "Say you'll think about it," he said with a small smile. He then pulled out the familiar velvet box. "There's one last piece of business." He opened it, and the star of Serafina seemed to glow with a new light. "It's clean now," he said softly. "Its legacy has been restored. It's time for it to go home." He didn't offer it to her. He simply held the box open. This time, Alara reached out without hesitation. She lifted the ring from its velvet cushion. It felt different in her hand, not heavy with sorrow, but alight with possibility. She looked from the ring to Julian's face, seeing in his eyes not the shadow of his father, but the light of a good man who had fought his way out of the darkness. Instead of putting it on her own finger, she took his hand. With a gentle, deliberate motion, she slid the ring onto his pinky finger. "What are you doing?" he asked, surprised. Allister was right about one thing, she said, her fingers lingering on his. "All heirlooms have to begin somewhere. This ring is no longer just a symbol of my family's past. It's a symbol of our shared future, a reminder of the truth we fought for. Let's create a new legacy for it together." Julian looked down at the ring on his hand, then back up at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet peace of the garden, he knew his father's greatest lesson had been a lie. Victory wasn't about what you took from others. It was about what you were willing to build together from the ruins of the truth. What started with 9 simple words from a waitress became a journey of justice, redemption, and the extraordinary power of truth. Alara and Julian proved that a legacy isn't just something you inherit. It's something you build choice by choice, truth by truth. Their story reminds us that even in a world that seems to be ruled by wealth and power, the courage to speak up and the integrity to listen can change everything. They didn't just reclaim a ring, they reclaimed their histories and forged a new future, proving that the most valuable thing in the world isn't a flawless sapphire, but a conscience that is clear. If this story of courage and unexpected alliances moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always matters. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you breathless. Click the notification bell so you never miss a single moment.